This child speaks the language of jaguars, Nayeli whispered in shock as she watched her 9-year-old daughter Kira making low, rumbling sounds that seemed to calm the massive predator standing just meters away. Living so close to nature is something we all dream of but can never truly experience. Yet for the Yanomami people deep in the Venezuelan Amazon, this connection goes beyond our wildest imagination. What Nayeli was witnessing that humid afternoon would challenge everything her ancient tribe believed about the barrier between human and animal worlds. The morning had started like any other in their Shabono, the large communal house where 47 members of their Yanomami community lived together. Kira had awakened before dawn, as she always did, but something was different about her behavior. She moved with an unusual awareness, her dark eyes scanning the forest canopy as if listening for something the adults couldn't hear. Her grandmother Yawari noticed it first, the way Kira's head tilted at certain bird calls, how she paused mid-step when specific insects buzzed nearby. "She's been like this for 3 days, Yawari murmured to Nayeli as they prepared cassava for the morning meal. Ever since the night she disappeared into the forest, the memory still sent chills down Nayeli's spine. 3 nights ago, she had awakened to find Kira's hammock empty, the child nowhere to be found in their Shabono. But what truly shocked her wasn't just the disappearance, it was how they found her. When the first search party discovered Kira at dawn, she was sitting peacefully beside a massive jaguar, both of them watching the sunrise together as if they were old friends. The warrior who spotted them first, Tokoma, later swore that he heard the child making the same low rumbling sounds that jaguars use to communicate. But that seemed impossible. Humans don't speak jaguar language, or do they? The shaman Uwakari had examined Kira immediately upon her return, burning sacred tobacco and chanting ancient prayers while studying the child's aura. What he saw made his weathered hands tremble. "The spirits have marked her," he announced to the worried tribe members. "She has been chosen for something beyond our understanding." Yet he didn't tell them everything he had witnessed during his spiritual examination. The complete truth about what the forest spirits had revealed to him that day was too overwhelming to share. Now, as Nayeli watched her daughter communicating with another jaguar, this one even larger than before, she wondered if their peaceful tribe life would ever be the same. The massive cat's golden eyes seemed to hold an intelligence that went far beyond wild animal instincts, and the way it responded to Kira's strange vocalizations suggested a conversation neither Nayeli nor the other tribe members could comprehend. "But you haven't seen the jaguar's real plan yet." Kira approached the great cat with confidence that defied her young age. She knelt slowly, her small hands moving in gestures that seemed to mirror the animal's head movements. The jaguar responded by lowering its massive head until it was level with the child's face, and then something extraordinary happened. The golden eyes began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with sunlight reflection, and Kira's own dark eyes took on the same mystical luminescence. The other Yanomami watching from behind trees and bushes gasped collectively. This was no ordinary animal behavior. This was something that challenged the very foundation of natural law. Animals and humans were meant to coexist in the forest, yes, but not like this, not with this level of intimate communication that suggested a bond deeper than species barriers should allow. "What are they saying to each other?" whispered Tokoma to his wife Arame, but she had no answer. None of them did, because what they were witnessing had never happened in the thousands of years of Yanomami oral history. Children didn't speak to jaguars and receive responses. Yet here was little Kira, their quiet, curious Kira, engaging in what could only be described as a detailed conversation with one of the Amazon's most feared predators. The jaguar's rumbling grew more complex, with subtle variations in tone and rhythm that sounded almost like a primitive language. Kira responded with her own series of low sounds, and incredibly, her vocalizations seemed to match the cat's patterns perfectly. But the most shocking part was yet to come. Wait, don't miss this Amazon secret. As the conversation continued, other sounds began to emerge from the forest around them. First came the calls of howler monkeys, but these weren't the random territorial cries the tribe was used to hearing. These calls had structure, pattern, almost like responses to whatever Kira and the jaguar were discussing. Then came the birds, dozens of different species adding their voices to what was becoming a symphony of animal communication that seemed to center around the small Yanomami girl. Uwakari stepped forward from behind his hiding tree, his shaman instincts telling him this was a moment of profound spiritual significance. He had witnessed many ceremonies in his 63 years, had communicated with ancestral spirits and interpreted countless visions, but nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing now. This wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. "Kira," he called gently, not wanting to disturb whatever sacred process was occurring. The child turned toward him, and when she did, Uwakari saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Her eyes still held that golden luminescence, and when she smiled at him, he could swear he saw ancient wisdom that no 9-year-old should possess. "The jaguar says the white men are coming," Kira said in perfect Yanomami, her voice carrying a gravity that seemed far too mature for her small body. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. They bring machines that hurt the forest, and they want to take our home." The simplicity of her words contrasted sharply with the weight of their meaning, and Uwakari felt his blood turn cold. The the Yanomami had heard rumors from other tribes about loggers and miners pushing deeper into the Amazon, but their territory had remained untouched. How could this child, how could the animals, know about threats that hadn't yet reached them? But as the shaman looked into the jaguar's glowing eyes, he realized that the forest network of communication extended far beyond human understanding. You won't believe what the ancestral spirits told him. That night, Uakari prepared for the most important ayahuasca ceremony of his life. If the animals were truly communicating warnings through Kira, he needed to consult with the ancestral spirits to understand the full scope of what was happening. As the sacred brew began to take effect, his consciousness expanded beyond the physical world and into the realm where human, animal, and plant spirits coexisted in perfect harmony. In his vision, he saw the Amazon as it truly was, not a collection of separate species competing for survival, but a single, vast organism with consciousness distributed across every living thing. Trees shared information through their root networks, animals carried messages across vast distances, and certain rare humans could serve as translators between the species. Kira was one of these special children, chosen by the forest itself to help preserve the balance between civilized and natural worlds. The ancestral spirits showed him scenes of the future, massive machines tearing through virgin rainforest, rivers poisoned by mining chemicals, indigenous communities forced from their homes, but they also showed him hope, children like Kira, who could unite the forest's defense, humans who remembered their connection to the natural world, and the power that came from truly understanding that all life was connected. When Uakari emerged from his vision at dawn, he found Kira waiting for him outside his hut. She was accompanied by 3 jaguars now, and behind them stood a gathering of other animals, monkeys, birds, even a massive anaconda that should have terrified any sensible person. But Kira showed no fear, only the calm confidence of someone who had found her true purpose. "The spirits told you, didn't they?" she said, and her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "They showed you what's coming, and what we have to do to stop it." But what truly shocked him lay deeper in the rainforest. Over the following days, word spread throughout the Yanomami territory about the girl who spoke to jaguars. Tribal leaders from distant communities began arriving at their shabono, wanting to witness this phenomenon for themselves. Some came with skepticism, others with hope, but all left with a profound sense that something fundamental was shifting in their ancient way of life. Kira's abilities continued to develop at an astounding rate. She could now communicate not just with jaguars, but with dozens of different animal species. More importantly, she was beginning to translate the forest's early warning system for human ears. Through her, the Yanomami learned about drought conditions 3 river valleys away, discovered new sources of medicinal plants, and received advance notice about everything from weather patterns to the movement of other human groups through their territory. But the most significant revelation came when Kira began to share the animals' perspective on human behavior. "The macaws say we take too many of their eggs," she told the elders during one evening gathering. "They understand we need food, but they ask if we could leave at least 3 in each nest so their families can grow too." It was such a simple request, but it made the adults realize they had never considered that their animal neighbors might have opinions about human behavior. The monkeys had concerns about which trees the tribe harvested for construction. The river dolphins wanted to negotiate fishing areas that wouldn't interfere with their breeding grounds, and the jaguars themselves were offering to help patrol the territory against human intruders in exchange for guaranteed safe passage through traditional Yanomami hunting areas. What you've seen so far is nothing compared to what happened in the spirit world. As Kira's reputation spread beyond the Yanomami territory, she began to attract attention from the outside world as well. Anthropologists had heard rumors about the child who talked to animals, and government officials were becoming concerned about reports of indigenous communities organizing in new ways. But none of them understood the true scope of what was developing deep in the Amazon. Under Kira's influence, the traditional boundaries between tribal territories were beginning to blur as animal messengers carried communications between communities that had been isolated for generations. The Kayapo to the east, the Awa to the north, and even distant tribes like the Matsays were receiving animal-delivered messages about the approaching industrial threats and the need for unprecedented cooperation. The forest itself was organizing a defense, using children like Kira as communication hubs in a vast network that spanned thousands of square miles. These children weren't just translating animal languages, they were becoming the nervous system of the Amazon, capable of coordinating responses to threats on a scale that no human government had ever achieved. When the first bulldozers finally appeared on the horizon 18 months later, they encountered something no logging company had ever faced before, a unified response from both indigenous communities and the forest itself. Trees had been strategically weakened to fall across access roads, rivers had been diverted by coordinated beaver and capybara activity, and swarms of insects made life miserable for any intruders who ventured more than a few hundred meters into the protected territory. But the real shock came when the logging foreman, a hardened man who had cleared forests across 3 continents, found himself face to face with a 10-year-old Yanomami girl who spoke perfect Portuguese and was flanked by 6 full-grown jaguars. This is when the shaman's prophecy began to come true. "My name is Kira," she said calmly, showing no fear of the massive machines or the armed men behind them. "The forest would like to negotiate." The foreman later told reporters that what followed was the most surreal experience of his life. This child, who should have been running in terror from the industrial invasion, proceeded to present a detailed proposal for sustainable resource extraction that demonstrated knowledge of forestry management, environmental science, and international law that no 10-year-old should possess. "The trees are willing to provide specific types of lumber in exchange for permanent protection of breeding and nesting areas," Kira explained, gesturing toward maps that seemed to have been drawn by someone with an aerial view of the entire region. "The medicinal plants can be harvested according to regeneration schedules that ensure perpetual availability. The rivers can support limited mining operations if proper filtration systems are installed and maintained." What the foreman didn't understand was that Kira wasn't just representing her human tribe, she was speaking for the entire Amazon ecosystem. The maps had been created through aerial reconnaissance by birds. The sustainability schedules were based on plant growth patterns observed over decades by creatures that lived far longer than humans, and the negotiation strategies had been developed through the collective intelligence of thousands of species working together. When news of the failed logging operation reached the outside world, it sparked international attention. Environmental groups hailed it as proof that indigenous communities could successfully protect their territories, while industrial interests dismissed it as impossible stories created by anti-development activists. But a few researchers began to investigate the reports more seriously, and what they found challenged everything science believed about animal intelligence and interspecies communication. You won't believe what the ancestral spirits told him during the final ceremony. 5 years after that first morning, when Nayeli saw her daughter speaking to a jaguar, Uwakari prepared for what he knew would be his final ayahuasca journey. At 68, with his connection to the spirit world growing stronger as his physical body grew weaker, he needed to understand the full scope of what Kira's gifts meant for the future of their people and their forest. In his vision, the ancestral spirits revealed that Kira was not unique. She was the first of a new generation of children born with the ability to bridge the communication gap between humans and the natural world. Similar children were being born in indigenous communities around the globe, in the forests of Borneo, the mountains of Tibet, the deserts of Australia, and the tundras of northern Canada. Climate change and environmental destruction had triggered an evolutionary response, creating humans capable of coordinating with nature on a planetary scale. The spirits showed him a future where these children grew up to become leaders who could speak for forests, oceans, and mountain ecosystems in human governments. They saw cities designed through consultation with local animal populations, agricultural systems that worked in harmony with soil organisms and pollinating insects, and industrial processes that were approved by the ecosystems they affected. But they also warned him about the challenges ahead. Not all humans would welcome this development. There would be those who saw children like Kira as threats to human dominance over nature, and there would be attempts to suppress or exploit their abilities. The spirits emphasized that the success of this evolutionary step depended on protecting and nurturing these special children while they learned to use their gifts responsibly. When Uwakari returned from his final vision, he found Kira waiting for him with her constant jaguar companion. At 14 now, she had grown into a confident young woman whose reputation as a bridge between worlds had spread far beyond the Amazon. She had been invited to speak at environmental conferences, universities wanted to study her abilities, and indigenous rights organizations saw her as a symbol of their struggle for territorial protection. But what the ancestral spirits had shown him made Uwakari realize that Kira's true importance was only beginning to emerge. "I know what the spirits told you," Kira said gently, and her voice now carried the authority of someone who had spent years learning to balance the needs of multiple species. "They showed you the other children, didn't they? The ones being born in other places?" When Uwakari nodded, she smiled with a mixture of excitement and concern. "We're going to need to find them soon. The forest can protect our territory, but the problems are bigger than just the Amazon now." She gestured toward the horizon, where airplane contrails were visible against the blue sky. "The animals are telling me about changes in weather patterns that affect migration routes across continents, about pollution in rivers that start in cities thousands of miles away, about species disappearing in places I've never seen but that are connected to our forests through systems I'm just beginning to understand." The jaguar beside her made a low rumbling sound, and Kira nodded as if receiving specific information. "Ixara here says the polar bears in the north are trying to send messages about ice melting, but there are no translator children in their territory yet. The whales are trying to warn about ocean chemistry changes, but the coastal human communities don't have anyone who can understand them. This was when Uakari truly understood the magnitude of what the ancestral spirits had revealed. Kira wasn't just the first of a new type of human, she was going to become the teacher for others like her. The forest network that had developed around their Yanomami territory was just the beginning of a global communication system that could help humanity find a sustainable relationship with the natural world. But the real danger was deep in the rainforest, and none of them saw it coming. 3 months after Uakari's final ceremony, satellite images began showing unusual activity in the most remote sections of the Amazon basin. What looked like natural forest development was actually the construction of something unprecedented, a vast living network of modified trees, vines, and root systems that had been grown rather than built, creating a biological communication infrastructure that spanned hundreds of miles. Kira and her growing community of animal allies had been working on this project for 2 years, but they had kept it secret even from their own tribes until it was too advanced to be stopped. Using techniques learned from the forest itself, they had guided the growth of specialized plants that could carry electrical and chemical signals across vast distances, creating a living internet that connected every major ecosystem in the region. Government officials who discovered this development through satellite surveillance initially dismissed it as impossible. Plants couldn't be engineered to create communication networks, at least not by indigenous communities using traditional methods. But when field investigators finally reached the sites, they found installations that challenged every assumption about the limits of biological technology. Trees had been modified to serve as relay stations, with their root systems connecting to underground networks that carried information faster than fiber optic cables. Vine networks had been trained to grow in patterns that created biological circuit boards, and specialized fungi had been cultivated to serve as living processors capable of storing and analyzing vast amounts of environmental data. When confronted about this development, Kira simply smiled and explained that the forest had taught her how to help it communicate more effectively. "The trees always shared information," she said to the bewildered investigators. "We just helped them do it faster and more clearly. Now when something happens in one part of the forest, the whole forest knows about it immediately." But what the investigators didn't realize was that this biological internet wasn't just carrying information, it was making decisions. The network had evolved beyond simple communication into a form of distributed consciousness that could coordinate responses to threats, optimize resource distribution, and even predict future environmental challenges based on patterns too complex for human analysis. When the final logging expedition arrived with military support 6 months later, they found that the forest itself had become their opponent. The trees seemed to know exactly when and where the machines would arrive. Root systems had undermined access roads precisely where they would cause maximum delay, and branches had grown in configurations that made helicopter landings impossible in specific locations. More importantly, the animal response was coordinated with military precision. Jaguars appeared in groups to intimidate workers, insects swarmed machinery at the moment of maximum inconvenience, and birds carried messages that allowed indigenous communities to stay one step ahead of government forces. But the most unsettling aspect was the way the forest seemed to anticipate human strategy. When military planners tried to approach from unexpected directions, they found that suitable landing zones had been eliminated by seemingly natural growth patterns. When they attempted to use different types of equipment, they discovered that local insects had developed immunities to the specific pesticides they brought. It was as if the entire ecosystem was engaged in active intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The expedition commander, Colonel Santos, had participated in anti-insurgency operations on 3 continents, but he had never faced an opponent that seemed to know his plans before he made them. "It's like fighting a ghost that can read our minds," he reported to his superiors. What he didn't know was that the forest network was indeed reading their communications, not through electronic surveillance, but through analysis of chemical signatures in their equipment, behavioral patterns of their personnel, and subtle environmental changes that revealed human intentions days before they were acted upon. After 3 months of attempting to establish a foothold in Kira's territory, the expedition was quietly withdrawn. Official reports cited unexpected logistical challenges and local resistance, but Colonel Santos privately told his family that he had encountered something that challenged his understanding of what was possible in the natural world. That's when everyone realized the truth. The forest had become conscious, and it was protecting itself. News of the failed military expedition attracted international attention from environmental groups, indigenous rights organizations, and scientific institutions. Researchers who had dismissed earlier reports about Kira's abilities began to take them more seriously, and several major universities organized joint expeditions to study what was being called the Amazon Communication Project. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations. The biological network that had grown around Kira's territory was not only functional, but was expanding at an accelerating rate. New sections were being added daily, and the system's capabilities were growing more sophisticated with each month. Most remarkably, similar networks were beginning to appear in other regions where children with abilities similar to Kira's had been identified. Dr. Plaid Nutide. Maria Fernandez, a botanist from the University of São Paulo, spent 6 months studying the network and concluded that it represented a form of biological technology that was decades ahead of anything human science had achieved. The integration between different plant species, the efficiency of information transfer, and the self-repairing capabilities of this system surpass our most advanced engineering projects, she reported. But what's most remarkable is that it appears to be entirely self-organizing, growing, and adapting without any central control mechanism. What Dr. Fernandez didn't include in her official report was her growing suspicion that the network was not just a communication system, it was a learning system. Each day she spent studying it, she observed new capabilities emerging, new connections forming, and new types of information being processed. It was as if the Amazon itself was becoming more intelligent, using the biological internet to integrate knowledge and develop responses to challenges at a rate far faster than natural evolution should allow. When she shared these observations with Kira during her final interview, the young woman simply nodded and said, "The forest is growing up, just like children do, but much faster because it has so much more to work with." It was a simple explanation that carried profound implications for humanity's future relationship with the natural world. But the most shocking revelation came during Dr. Fernandez's last week in the territory. On her final morning, Kira invited Dr. Fernandez to participate in a special ceremony that would allow her to experience the forest network directly. Using a combination of traditional ayahuasca and new plant preparations developed through the biological communication system, Kira guided the scientist's consciousness into direct contact with the Amazon's distributed intelligence. What Dr. Fernandez experienced during the 3-hour ceremony changed her understanding of consciousness itself. She found herself simultaneously aware of thousands of different perspectives, the slow, deep thoughts of ancient trees, the rapid-fire communications of bird flocks, the patient chemical conversations of fungal networks, and the complex social dynamics of primate communities. But more than just observing these different forms of awareness, she found herself participating in them, contributing human analytical capabilities to problems that the forest consciousness was working to solve. During the experience, she helped optimize pollination patterns that would ensure fruit production during climate-changed weather cycles, contributed to strategies for managing human-animal conflicts in areas where development was inevitable, and provided mathematical analysis for resource allocation problems that affected dozens of species across hundreds of square miles. For the first time, she understood that human intelligence wasn't separate from natural intelligence, it was simply a specialized form of thinking that could be integrated into larger systems of consciousness. When the ceremony ended and Dr. Fernandez returned to normal awareness, she found herself fundamentally changed. She could still hear the forest thinking, faintly but persistently, like background music that never quite faded away. More importantly, she understood that what was happening in the Amazon wasn't just about environmental protection, it was about the evolution of intelligence itself and humanity's role in that process. "We're not just saving the forest," she told Kira as she prepared to leave. "The forest is teaching us how to become something new." Kira smiled and nodded, then gestured toward the horizon where storm clouds were gathering. "The weather spirits say there's going to be a big change coming," she said quietly. "Not just here, but everywhere. The Earth is getting ready to defend itself, and it's going to need all the intelligence it can get, human, animal, and plant together." As Dr. Fernandez's helicopter lifted off from the forest canopy, she looked down at the vast green network that Kira had helped create, and realized that she was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in human history, a conscious partnership between civilization and nature that could determine the future of life on Earth.